Originally featured in the August 1998 issue of Guitar World, Ozzy Osbourne, To Hell and Back by Jeff Kitts. The incredible saga of Ozzy Osbourne, the English lad who rose from dirt to become a thief, a rocker, a lover, and a sinner, and the foremost heavy metal artist of all time. Ozzy Osbourne was up Schitt's Creek. The one-time lead singer of metal superstars Black Sabbath had been fired by that band in 1978, and now, just 1 year later, the man who gave the world such classics as War Pigs and Paranoid couldn't get even a nibble from the record companies. Ozzy looked washed up, but all that was about to change. Rejected by nearly every label, Osbourne finally found a supporter in CBS Records executive Tony Martell, who signed Ozzy to a contract. But Martell was pretty much alone at CBS in his enthusiasm for Ozzy. Sensing the company's disinterest, Sharon Osbourne, Ozzy's future wife and manager, arranged for a lunch meeting at the label's New York City offices in May 1981 as a way of introducing the staff to Ozzy and getting them behind the project. Sharon had Ozzy bring 2 white doves to the meeting, which he planned to release as a gesture of goodwill. As the birds flopped around the room, Ozzy introduced himself to the 25 or so CBS executives gathered for the meeting. For a brief moment, the singer, a little buzzed from some cognac he'd drowned earlier in the day, quit making the rounds and sat on the leg of a girl who worked in the publicity department. With the chords of Crazy Train roaring in the background, one of the birds landed on Ozzy's knee. He picked it up without hesitation, put it into his mouth, and bit off its head. The CBS suits, horrified at the sight of the headless dove's bloody carcass convulsing on a polished conference table, summarily dismissed Ozzy and Sharon. "We were asked to leave the building," remembers Sharon, who was herself shocked by the actions of her future husband. Word of the incident spread quickly. Ozzy Osbourne, depraved rock and roll lunatic, was back in business. These days, Ozzy Osbourne has it all: a rock-solid marriage, 3 happy children, mansions on 2 continents, a clean bill of health, and the abiding love and admiration of millions. But Ozzy's almost bourgeoisie contentment is only a recent phenomenon. Much of his tumultuous 30-year career has been spent contending with depression, various personal tragedies, and a fierce drug and alcohol addiction. He's been to hell and back, the burn marks clearly visible in his limp, occasionally blatant stare, and marked stutter. John Michael Osborne was born in Birmingham, England on December 3, 1948. His parents, John and Lillian Osborne, were both factory workers, which meant that money, food, and clothes, particularly for a family of 8, Ozzy had 5 sisters, were scarce. "I had 1 pair of shoes, 1 pair of socks, never wore underwear, 1 pair of pants, and 1 jacket. That was it," says Ozzy. Lacking even the most basic amenities, Ozzy would regularly lose himself in the pound and beat and passion of rock and roll, which helped him imagine a more exciting life beyond his blue-collar hometown. "I loved music as a child, the magic behind rock and roll," says Osbourne. "My sisters would bring home Chuck Berry records, and I would sing and dance around the house. At night, I would lie awake and fantasize about doing something really great." Ozzy's impoverished existence may have been difficult, but the truth is that it pretty much all that he could expect, as he and his family lived a typical Birmingham life. His school days, however, were truly nightmarish. He was often tormented by bullies, and suffering from dyslexia, he consistently scored low grades. One of his regular abusers, an older schoolmate, was a guitar player named Frank, aka Tony Iommi, who would years later team up with Ozzy to form Black Sabbath. "I used to hate the sight of him," recalls Iommi. "I couldn't stand him, and I used to beat him up whenever I saw him. We just didn't get on at school. He was a little punk." Ozzy left school at 15 and bounced around from job to job, working for a time at a car horn factory and in a slaughterhouse. By age 17, however, he was no longer earning an honest day's pay, having turned to a life of petty crime. Spending a few months in jail, he was caught stealing a television, was enough to make Ozzy rethink his career as a larcenist, and he emerged from Winson Green prison with the letters OZZY tattooed on his knuckles, and a new determination to pursue a career in music. In 1966, when Ozzy was 18, the Beatles were at the peak of their fame, and no rock and roll band had a more profound influence on him. Swept away by Beatlemania, Ozzy knew what he wanted to do with his life. "The whole hysteria around the Beatles just sucked me in. I felt like it was my way out," says Ozzy. "I wanted to be a Beatle. I used to fantasize about stuff like one of the Beatles marrying my sister. Armed with nothing more than his rather nasal singing voice and a small 50-watt Vox PA system his father went into debt to buy, Ozzy looked to form a band, and to that end placed an ad in a local music shop window. In those days, if you had a PA system, you were accepted as a singer whether you could sing or not because nobody could afford the equipment, recalls Ozzy. The first to answer the ad was a local guitar player named Terrence Geezer Butler. He and Ozzy formed a band called Rare Breed, which broke up after 2 gigs. Soon thereafter, two other local Birmingham musicians, Tony Iommi, Osbourne's old schoolyard antagonist, and drummer Bill Ward, saw Ozzy's advertisement and headed over to his house at 14 Lodge Road. It's pretty amazing, actually, says Iommi. Bill and I were looking for a singer, and we spotted this advert that said, singer looking for a gig, call Ozzy at ... I said to Bill, I know an Ozzy, it can't possibly be that one. So we went to the address listed in the ad and knocked on the door. Sure enough, Ozzy appeared. I said to Bill, forget it, forget it. But Bill wanted to chat with him. We talked, but when we left, I said, no way, Bill. I know him. 3 weeks later, we ended up together anyway. Life moves in mysterious ways. With Iommi handling all the guitar duties, Butler switched to bass by removing 2 strings from his guitar. Ozzy named the group the Polka Tulk Blues Band, and the foursome began learning blues covers and writing original material. The band soon changed its name to Earth and hit the local blues clubs in search of gigs. Earth was a competent band, but they were really no better than the countless other English groups then trying to play traditional black American blues. It became clear to Osbourne, Iommi, and the rest that the local music fans were beginning to have enough of being force-fed mediocre blues and wanted something different. Besides jacking up the decibels to frightening levels, Earth started playing heavier, more distorted riff-based material. The result, when Earth took the stage at a local pub, audience had no choice but to take notice. And it was the fans who provided a more specific impetus to change. It used to drive us mad to think that we were up there working so hard, playing our guts out while all these guys were sitting around and chattering, says drummer Bill Ward. So we turned up the volume louder and louder until it was impossible for anyone to have a conversation. As their sound developed into a more bruising dirge, the band took on a new, more frightful persona that would further distance Earth from the local blues competition. Lyricist Geezer Butler suddenly turned his attention toward darker subjects like nuclear war and on the supernatural, while Iommi and his trusty Gibson SG produced one chilling detuned mudslide after another. It quickly became obvious to the band that a name change was in order. As they headed into rehearsal one day, they noticed that the movie's house across the street was showing the 1935 Boris Karloff horror classic Black Sabbath. I asked myself, remembers Ozzy, why is there a line of people with money in their hands paying to get the shit scared out of them? It's because people get a thrill out of being around evil. It soon became clear that the band's choice of a name was a very good one, though most of England's record companies evinced no interest in releasing Sabbath's first album, recorded toward the end of 1969 in 8 hours for a mere $1,500 American dollars. The Vertical label had the foresight to release it in February 1970 and was soon reaping the benefits as rock fans throughout the world embraced Sabbath as the perfect antidote to 60s flower power. The whole hippie thing was still happening around the time, says Ozzy, and for us that was bullshit. We lived in a dreary, polluted, dismal town in Birmingham, and we were angry about it, and that was reflected in our music. Due no doubt to the music's demonic nature and unforgiving heaviness, radio wanted no part of Sabbath, and the critics lambasted them at every turn, yet their debut album sold well, eventually reaching number 8 on the UK chart and number 23 in America. For the first time in his life, Ozzy was a success, and money started coming in. If slowly at first, with his first royalty check, he gave his mother £50, then took the rest and bought a pair of shoes and a bottle of cheap cologne, because I hated the way I smelled. As Sabbath grew in popularity, the band's, particularly Ozzy's, drinking and drug habits worsened. We had money to burn and booze coming out of our ears, says Ozzy. Later Sabbath albums like Paranoid, 1970, Masters of Reality, 71, Volume 4, 72, and Sabbath Bloody Sabbath, 73, broke the band wide open, earning them international superstar status. But there was a steep price to pay for all the fame. The band's rampant drinking and drug usage began to undermine their creative output. Ozzy remembers the atmosphere surrounding the recording of Volume 4, an album which, save for a few gems like Snowbird and Supernaut, is widely regarded as a convoluted mess. When we did that album, it was like one big Roman orgy. We'd be in the jacuzzi all day doing coke, and every now and again we'd get up to do a song. Tony Iommi recalls one particularly heinous incident from around this period. We were all in an elevator in the really plush hotel, and Ozzy decides to take a crap. As he's doing it, the elevator is going down to the reception floor. The doors open suddenly, and there's Ozzy with his pants around his knees, and all these people in fur coats are just staring at him with their mouths open. Clearly, Ozzy and Sabbath were riding high, living the wild rock and roll life that they had always dreamed of, but unbeknownst to them, all was not right with their financial affairs. Due to years of mismanagement and despite having sold millions of records in 1974, the members of Sabbath realized they were broke. Down but far from out, the band took to managing themselves for a while and eventually hired a well-heeled English manager named Don Arden. The introduction of Arden into the fold turned out to have a marginal effect on the band's career, but it did make a turning point in Ozzy's personal and professional life. Arden's 18-year-old daughter, Sharon, worked in his management company as a receptionist, and it was she who eventually spearheaded Ozzy's solo career and became the rock in his otherwise unstable life. He frightened the life out of me, says Sharon of her first meeting with Ozzy. He had on a pajama top, no shoes, and was wearing a faucet on a string around his neck. That was his ideal of jewelry. But we kept meeting on a regular basis, and after a while I found him to be very sweet and very funny. He was like a little puppy, very vulnerable. Ironically, it wasn't long after Sabbath began working with Don Arden and Ozzy began falling for his daughter that the relationship between the band and its frontman began to unravel. As evidenced by the musical disjointed and poor-selling Technical Ecstasy 1976 album, Sabbath was losing its focus as a band, a circumstance which more than likely was the result of a lethal combination of the group's recent mass success, managerial distractions, and excessive drug use. As Ozzy grew more distant and disinterested in making music with Sabbath, the band's frustrations neared their boiling point. We had totally lost our way by that point, says Iommi, and we were all into drugs, not just Ozzy. It was taking longer and longer to make records. Ozzy received a crushing blow in 1977 when his father died, sending the singer into a severe state of depression. Unsure of whether he wanted to continue with his career, Ozzy actually quit Black Sabbath for a brief period while the band was writing material for its next album, Never Say Die. He returned 2 days before recording began but refused to sing any of the material that was written in his absence. We ended up having to write in the day so we could record in the evening, and we never had time to review the tracks and make changes, says Iommi. As a result, the album sounds very confused. Though Ozzy had returned to complete the album and subsequent tour, it was clear to Tony and the rest of Sabbath that the time had come to replace Ozzy. We knew we had to bring in somebody else, says Iommi. Geezer and Bill would say to me, either Ozzy goes or we go. At that point, Bill was becoming the businessman of the band with his briefcase and his haircut, and he effing goes and tells Ozzy, Tony wants to get rid of you, he laughs. Ozzy always thought that I fired him on my own, when it was really the other two who wanted him out. But I wasn't too pleased with Ozzy either. Ozzy had battled depression for most of his life, but being fired from Sabbath brought him to his all-time lowest point. I wasn't just depressed, remembers Ozzy. I wanted to end it. I stayed in a hotel room in Hollywood for 6 months and never opened the drapes. I lived like a slob. With his body ravaged by excessive drug and alcohol intake, his psyche neared the breaking point, and his personal wealth all but gone, Ozzy, who was now pretty much alone in the world, desperately needed a savior. He got it one day during the summer of 1979 when Sharon Arden came to his hotel to collect the $500 a mutual friend had given Ozzy to hold. Of course, Ozzy had long since blown the money on booze and drugs, and Sharon was furious. Yet somehow, her anger was overshadowed by her fondness for Ozzy and her conviction that he could still revive his sagging career. I would lecture him like a schoolteacher about the way he was living, says Sharon. I told him he had to pull himself together, and he did. She saved my life, says Ozzy. With the help of Sharon's prodding, Ozzy geared himself up for the next phase of his career, a solo artist. For Sharon, who was still working for her father, Ozzy's solo venture was the opportunity she had been looking for to strike out on her own as a rock manager. I never had any doubts about Ozzy going out on his own, says Sharon. He just has this natural gift to entertain. Rejuvenated, Ozzy began holding auditions in the fall of 1979 in Los Angeles. After hiring former Uriah Heep drummer Lee Kerslake and former Rainbow bassist Bob Daisley, all that remained for Ozzy to find was a guitarist. Randy Rhoads was a 23-year-old local guitarist who had recorded 2 albums with the LA rock outfit Quiet Riot, released only in Japan, and had come to the audition at the recommendation of Dana Strum, a friend of Sharon and Ozzy's, who later became the bassist for the group Slaughter. When Randy first walked in, I thought he was a guy in drag, recalls Sharon. He was so beautiful and so little. While these were hardly the physical attributes Ozzy was looking for in a guitarist, Randy walked into Ozzy's LA hotel room, fired up his Charvel guitar, and let loose with a blazing fury of classical runs and hard-edged riffing. His physical grace and demonic speed floored Ozzy, who, despite being in a delicate condition, almost immediately knew that he had found the last piece of the puzzle. When he turned up, unfortunately, I was stoned out of my mind. I was on another planet, says Ozzy. Some guys woke me up and said, "He's here." I looked up and Randy started playing from this tiny amp. Even in my semi-consciousness, he blew my mind. I told him to come by the next day and that he had the gig. With his band together, it was time for Ozzy to show the world that he could be an even more potent performer on his own than he was during his years with Sabbath. He had a lot of help. It wasn't long before Ozzy and Randy became close friends, something Ozzy had lacked during his Sabbath tenure. Their relationship was even stronger when it came to work, feeding off of each other's distinctly different musical sensibilities. Ozzy's flair for coming up with good hooks, Randy's disciplined virtuosity. They made a truly magical duo. Since Randy was a guitar teacher, he had a lot of patience and would give me the time to come up with ideals, says Ozzy, whereas Black Sabbath would just say, "Okay, here's a riff, put a vocal line here." Though Ozzy was still far from clean and sober at this point, he did have more fire in his belly than booze. With Randy at his side, Ozzy regained his confidence and in March 1980 recorded his debut album, Blizzard of Oz. Released in September of that year on Don Arden's Jet Records label, distributed through CBS, quickly became a benchmark album for Ozzy. Despite its creepy Sabbath-esque cover image depicting a red-caped, demon-possessed Ozzy wielding a crucifix, musically, Blizzard of Oz was a markedly different animal from his former band, offering a cleaner and more sophisticated alternative to Sabbath's trademark sludge, but it did rock in a serious way, proving to be a far tighter and more substantial effort than anything Sabbath had done in years. Young female metalers who had no use for Sabbath's monolithic brutality suddenly gravitated toward Ozzy's melodic, radio-friendly hooks on songs like Crazy Train and I Don't Know, while the guitar community embraced Randy's blistering, neoclassical fretwork and gothic pop compositions. Blizzard of Oz spearheaded a new era in metal and put Ozzy at the top of his game, ultimately selling over 5 million copies. Things were going well for Ozzy, and his good fortune continued the following year with the release of Diary of a Madman, also on Jet CBS Records. For this album, Blizzard drummer Kerslake and bassist Daisley were replaced by Tommy Aldridge, formerly the drummer with Black Oak, Arkansas, and Rudy Sarzo, who had played in Quiet Riot with Randy. To some, Diary, with its thunderous opening track, Over the Mountain, and the road showcase Flying High Again, was an even stronger album than its predecessor. It posted equally impressive sales figures. When we were recording, he would disappear into the studio for days, says Ozzy of Rhodes. I'd ask him what he was doing, and he would say, "I'm working on this solo, and I still can't get it." Finally, it would come to him, and he would call me and say, "Listen to this." It would always tear my head off. By this point, Ozzy and Sharon were inseparable as business partners and lovers, but there remained one enormous impediment to their happiness. Ozzy was still married to one Thelma Riley, a local Birmingham girl he'd married during Sabbath's early years, and with whom he had 2 children, Jessica and Louie. As time wore on, Ozzy and Thelma's relationship grew strained, no doubt due to Ozzy's long stretches away from home and his continued substance abuse. "I was taking drugs so much, I was a wreck," recalls Ozzy. "The final straw came when I shot all our cats. We had about 17 and I went crazy and shot them all. My wife found me under the piano in a white suit, a shotgun in one hand and a knife in the other." The Diary of a Madman tour was a smashing success, but Ozzy's excesses were nearing dangerous proportions. The heavy metal hero, adored by millions of youngsters, was rapidly degenerating into every mother's nightmare. It wasn't uncommon for Ozzy to spend an entire night after a show drinking, which is what he did one night in January 1982 while on a tour stop in San Antonio, Texas. Sharon, in an effort to keep Ozzy confined to the hotel, hid all of his clothes. So Ozzy donned one of Sharon's dresses and a pair of high heels and headed outside at around 7 a.m. Sometime that morning, he'd stopped to urinate on an old wall. Unfortunately, the wall turned out to be part of the Alamo, site of the legendary 1836 battle between the Texans and the Mexican army. Ozzy was promptly arrested and barred from playing in San Antonio for the next decade. During a concert later that month in Des Moines, Iowa, a fan hurled a dead bat up on stage. Thinking it was a toy, Ozzy picked it up and bit off its head. He was rushed to the hospital after the show as a precaution and had to receive preventative rabies shots for the next few weeks. Diary of a Madman, indeed. For a period of 5 years, Ozzy's life had ping-ponged between tragedy and triumph. The death of his father, his firing from Black Sabbath, his resurgence as a heavy metal icon, his ongoing battle with drugs and alcohol, etc. But it all paled in comparison to the catastrophe that struck on March 19th, 1982, the day his best friend and musical inspiration, Randy Rhoads, died in a freak plane crash in Leesburg, Florida. Sharon recalls the events surrounding the incident. It was an overnight drive to Orlando, where we were scheduled to play at the Rock Super Bowl 14 festival with Foreigner and UFO. We had to go past the home of the bus driver, Andrew Aycock. He lived at this place called the Flying Baron Estates. The buses were kept there, and he needed a couple of spare parts. We pulled into this area, and there was a small landing strip with some small aircraft. There was a big green field, 3 houses, and the airfield. Ozzy and I were asleep on the bus. There was also bassist Rudy Sarzo, drummer Tommy Aldridge, Randy Ozzy, a tour manager named Jack Duncan, keyboardist Don Airy, the bus driver's ex-wife, and Rachel Youngblood, who was a 58-year-old lady who took care of all the band's clothes and cooked for them. She was a great friend of ours. It was about 9 in the morning. Don Airy and the bus driver were awake, and they saw the planes. It turns out the bus driver was also a pilot, even though none of his paperwork was in order. We also learned later on that he had been in a previous crash where a young boy was killed. Anyway, Don asked the driver, who apparently took one of the planes from the compound without permission, to take him up for a ride. So they go up for a while and land. Don then comes back in the bus and wakes everybody else up to go on the plane. Well, nobody else would go except Randy and Rachel. They went up, and the bus driver's ex-wife was standing outside the bus watching. And then, before you knew it, the plane came down and went right through the bus and into one of the houses. Ozzy and I woke up. The back of the bus crushed down on us, and we had no idea what was happening. I ran to a nearby house to call for help, and it turned out that the owner of the house was also the owner of the plane. He and his wife just sat there, not offering to help and refusing to believe that a house across the way was on fire. And this has never been discussed before, but Ozzy actually ran inside the house after the crash because he saw a man walking around inside who didn't know that his house was on fire. He was deaf, and Ozzy went in and pulled him out. It was just a horrible scene. The house was on fire, airplane pieces were scattered all around, the bus was destroyed, and there was blood and bodies everywhere. There was nothing left. The pilot died, Rachel died, and Randy died instantly. The whole thing will always be a mystery to us. Randy was terrified of flying. What would make him go up there? Ozzy and I still wonder about it until the day we die. In my opinion, there was more going on. In the autopsy report, they found cocaine in the bus driver's system, a considerable amount, and of course he had been fighting with his ex-wife. I think for that one instant while flying, he looked down at his ex-wife and said, "Forget this," and tried to kill her. While Randy and Rachel, who incidentally didn't even like each other, had to be on that plane, though, it was just a horrific day. Though Ozzy prefers not to discuss the bizarre circumstances surrounding Rhodes' death, he is quick to acknowledge Randy's brief but undeniable impact on the rock guitar community. He was an exceptional musician, a dedicated guitarist, and he was always fun to be around, says Ozzy. He could be so shy, but then people would hear him play and he'd blow them off the face of the earth. If he were still here with us, he'd be at the forefront of what guitarists are doing. He'd be the leader. Not a day goes by that I don't think about him. Though clearly devastated and uncertain of his future as a solo artist, Ozzy made immediate plans to return to the road. The reasons were twofold: a combination of needing the money that would be generated by a lengthy summer tour, After selling 5.5 million copies of the first album, Ozzy received only $15,000 in royalties, says Sharon, referring to Ozzy's unfavorable contract with her father's record label. An instant therapy to cope with Randy's death. Getting back on the road was the only thing we could do at that point, says Sharon. If we had stayed home and done nothing, the band would have fallen apart. I never would have been able to get Ozzy back on stage again. In the few years before Randy died, I had gone through so much, says Ozzy. My father had died. I'd got kicked out of Sabbath. I was up and down, up and down. Then Randy got killed. At that point, I said to Sharon, I can't keep doing this. And she said, yes, you can. If Randy was alive, this is what he would want you to do. So I decided the best thing to do would be to get back out on the road. And it wasn't the most amazing show, but we did it. Finding a suitable replacement for Rhodes was not an easy task for Ozzy. First to be approached was ex Thin Lizzy guitarist Gary Moore, who was also managed by Sharon, but he declined. Michael Schenker volunteered, but his asking price was too high, especially in view of Ozzy's financial troubles. Then, as singer Ian Gillan disbanded his own outfit, Gillan to join Black Sabbath, Gillan's guitarist Bernie Tormé was tapped by Ozzy to replace Randy on the tour. But Tormé, a disciple of the Hendrix school of blues-based rock guitar, was clearly not the right man to fill Rhodes' stylistic shoes. Bernie was okay, but Randy wasn't dead a month. And it's a hard thing for any guitarist to be in that position, says Ozzy. I wouldn't have done it. After a few weeks, Tormé told Ozzy he was planning to leave the tour, and Ozzy once again found himself in search of a new guitarist. Longtime Night Ranger guitarist Brad Gillies tells the story of how he, a 24-year-old Californian, was suddenly thrust into the spotlight as Randy's second replacement. I was with the band Ranger before we were Night Ranger, and we were looking for a record deal. But we weren't doing very many gigs, so just to keep busy, I put together another rock band called the Alameda All-Stars. We played around California, and during the shows, we would do two Ozzy songs, Flying High Again and Mr. Crowley. About 2 weeks after Randy died, a friend of mine who also knew Ozzy's drummer, Tommy Aldridge, told Tommy about me, and Tommy told Sharon and Ozzy. Next thing I know, I get a call from Sharon asking me to fly out to New York for an audition. I had about 2 days to learn the entire set list. I thought it was going to be a rigorous audition process, but when I got there, it was just me. For the next 5 days, Gillies traveled with the band, watching the shows, learning the set, and practicing for 10 hours a day. Finally, with Tormé about to leave, Ozzy asked Gillies if he was ready. Their first show together was in Binghamton, New York, one of the scariest nights of my life, says Gillies. I pretty much pulled off every song that night except for Revelation, Mother Earth, which starts off slow, then picks up speed somewhere in the middle, and I came in one verse too early. Ozzy looked over at me after realizing that I was in the wrong section, and I quickly had to recover and find my place. After that show, everyone congratulated me for doing a good job, and Ozzy came over to me and said, we won't screw up on Revelation anymore, will we? And I said, no, we won't. But it was tough for me in the beginning. A lot of the fans out there were holding up Randy lives signs and giving me the finger and stuff, but they came around eventually. In July 1982, Ozzy and his longtime companion, Sharon Arden, were married in Maui, Hawaii. Gillies recalls the celebration. That was a trip. They had a little Hawaiian band playing at the reception, a couple of acoustic guitars and a two-piece drum kit, and we got up and did Paranoid on acoustic guitars, with Randy Sarzo playing an upright bass and Ozzy singing in his little wedding outfit. With his new marriage, the successful continuation of the tour, despite Randy's death and both Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman climbing back up the charts, things were clearly going well for Ozzy. Yet despite all the good fortune in his life, Ozzy's drinking and drug abuse had once again spun out of control. I remember we had to cancel a show in Bakersfield, California, because Ozzy pretty much couldn't play the gig, recalls Gillies. We told the audience that he had food poisoning and that we'd taken him to the hospital, but really he was just passed out in the back of the bus. He was drinking a lot in those days and dabbling in other things, and we helped him out as much as we could by being supportive. Things were going good for him, but he was still depressed over Randy's death. He needed real help to pull him through this. Around this time, Sharon and Ozzy were desperately trying to break free from the financially constricting contract Ozzy had with her father and Jet Records. My father used to take 90% and get the artist only 10%, says Sharon, but Arden wouldn't budge, aware that letting Ozzy go could mean losing millions of dollars in potential income. A vicious legal battle between Sharon and her father ensued, and while the two had not exactly seen eye to eye since she left his company a few years earlier, This power struggle led to the final break in their relationship, professionally and personally. Eventually, after paying Don Arden $1.5 million for Ozzy's contract and delivering one last album to fulfill the artist's contractual obligations to Jet Records, 1982's Live Speak the Devil, which featured only Black Sabbath songs recorded in the current tour, Ozzy and Sharon's dealings with her father and his company were finally over. While this was considered a victory within the Osbourne camp, it's clear that certain scars still have not healed. Asked if her father is still alive today, Sharon's icy response is yes, he is, unfortunately. Not long after the release of Speak of the Devil, with the successful world tour winding down to a close, Brad Gillies felt that the time had come to leave Ozzy's band and return home to pursue a career with Night Ranger. When Night Ranger finally got a record deal, I had to make a choice, recalls Gillies. I had spent many years with those guys, and I was more comfortable in a band situation than I was being a sideman, so I told Ozzy, and he was cool about it. I'm forever indebted to Brad because he put his own project on hold so he could come out and help me on the tour, says Ozzy. And when he was ready to leave, I said, "You should go with your heart, Brad, because you don't owe me a thing. If anything, I owe you." For the fourth time in little more than 3 years, Ozzy was in need of a new guitarist. Again, he enlisted the help of Dana Strum, the man responsible for introducing Ozzy to Randy. Strum handpicked 25 guitarists from around the LA area and sent tapes, pictures, and bios of each to Ozzy. One applicant was 24-year-old Jakey Lee, who had been sitting idle since leaving his band Rough Cut 3 months earlier. From those 25, Ozzy picked three, remembers Lee: me, Mitch Perry, who played with Michael Schenker for a while, and George Lynch. George actually got the gig before I did and went on the road with Ozzy's band for about 2 weeks to watch and learn the material. I figured that George had it, but then Dana called me and said that Ozzy wanted to audition me and Mitch with the band. So a few days later, we went to SIR Studios in New York for the audition. Mitch went first, I went second, and after I played, Ozzy came up to me and said, "If you want it, you got it." Then George walked in and Ozzy turned to him and said, "You've lost a gig, it's his," and walked away. I've seen Ozzy fire a couple of people and it's never pleasant. Though they would work together for only a few years and eventually part under not so amicable circumstances, it was clear that Ozzy had made yet another marvelous discovery in Jakey Lee. 1983's Bark at the Moon album showcased Lee's fiery shred ability and penchant for wah-wah saturated leads and razor-sharp metallic riffing, making him the ideal successor to Randy Rhoads and an important figure in the evolution of 80s rock guitar. His flashy showmanship, both as a player and performer, radiated a confidence that quickly endeared him to Ozzy's fan base, though Ozzy himself was hardly tickled by Jake's cocksure attitude. Jake was fine for the first 3 days, then he wanted to take over, says Ozzy. Randy wasn't like that, he was one of the cool guys. I wouldn't say Jake and I got along, but I wouldn't say we didn't get along. In the last few years, he became very reserved, and it was hard to communicate with him. We lived together in a house in Beverly Hills, and we never spoke. It wasn't because we didn't like each other. We just didn't have anything to say. Not the relationship I wanted with Jake, but a festering cancer set in. If I ask, "What do you think of that?" I want a reaction. If it's negative, we'll try something else. That's not a problem. But Jake would shrug his shoulders, raise an eyebrow, and walk away. To be fair, Jake did have a fantastic presence and was a great guitar player. As one might expect, Jake, too, had less than favorable recollections of his time working with Ozzy. He was effed up and drunk most of the time, pretty much for the whole 4 years I was with him. He would guzzle whole bottles of cognac. I never saw anyone drink like him. It created a lot of communication problems between Ozzy and the rest of the band. There were plenty of nights where he'd knock on my hotel door at 3 o'clock in the morning, get me out of bed, tell me to plug in my guitar and turn on the tape recorder. He'd start trying to tell me about the ideal he had for his song, but it would be all mumbling and incoherent, and he'd get really pissed off at me because I couldn't understand what he wanted me to do. Ozzy's drug and alcohol consumption was at an all-time high during his years, with Jakey Lee sending his health into decline and his weight into the stratosphere. He ultimately reached 220 pounds, which he says was all from beer. In the liner notes to his 1986 album, The Ultimate Sin, Ozzy thanked all his friends at the Betty Ford Center. "There was one show that I'll always remember," says Jake. "It was at some outdoor festival somewhere, and Ozzy and Sharon had gotten into a big argument before the show, and she took off with the kids on the tour bus. Ozzy drank so much that day that he was totally effed up by showtime. He put on one of Sharon's dresses, some high heels, and a big flowery sunbonnet, and put on some lipstick. We started the first song, and halfway through, Ozzy just quit singing. Then he started telling the audience about he and Sharon had had a fight and that she had left him, and what was he going to do? The tour manager was off to the side of the stage yelling at me to start the next song, so I did, and Ozzy got real pissed. He made me stop playing, and then he started telling the story again. A couple of the road crew guys came out and took Ozzy off the stage, and the band left too. I don't think the crowd was too pleased about it. On March 19th, 1987, exactly 5 years after Randy Rhoads' death, Ozzy released the tribute album, a collection of never-before-heard live music from a 1981 Canadian performance featuring the late guitarist. After Randy's death, I just wanted to hold on to the material, remembers Ozzy. It was locked away in a vault. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to even know about it. When we found the recording years later and listened to it, it took only about a minute and we were devastated. It was that good. Any initial fears or worries we had about putting the record out were put to rest that fast. People just had to hear it, hear Randy play. That's all I could think. This is actually the only official recording of us live with Randy. That's why it's special. Soon after the release of the tribute album, Jakey Lee was relieved of his position in Ozzy's band. Ozzy started telling people that I didn't want the tribute album to come out, but that was never true, says Jake. I think it was just his way of trying to justify firing me, because there really didn't seem to be a reason. In any case, Ozzy was once more in need of a guitarist. Only a few months would pass before he would make yet another discovery, this time a 19-year-old unknown from New Jersey, Zakk Wylde. I remember sifting through the pile of tapes one day and picking up one and saying, "Look here, a Randy Rhoads clone," remembers Ozzy. It was a picture of some guy with long blonde hair playing a Les Paul Custom. I couldn't even bring myself to listen to his tape. I tossed it back in the pile and forgot about it. Then about 6 months later, my drummer, Randy Castillo, walks in and says, "I found this great guitarist, and his name is Zakk." I walked into the audition and I knew I'd seen him before, but I couldn't remember where. He plugged in and played my whole catalog note for note. He had a bounce and a spark about him. Then I realized where I saw Zakk before. He was the Randy Rhoads clone in the photo, only it turned out that he wasn't a Randy clone at all. With his bell-bottoms Confederate flag guitar and screeching shit-kicker licks, Zakk Wylde was a fresh face on the guitar scene, a grungy, unbridled combination of Rhoads' skill and Lee's flashiness, yet clearly his own. Zakk ceased being an official member of Ozzy's band in 1995. He was negotiating with Guns N' Roses, had his Bride and Glory project going, and said he wanted to tour with me, says Ozzy. He obviously didn't know what he wanted to do, so I made up his mind for him. Despite the guitarist's departure, his trademark squeaks and squeals and churning metal riffs graced the last three Osbourne studio albums: No Rest for the Wicked, 1988, No More Tears, 1991, and Osmosis, 1995. Today, Ozzy has taken a wait-and-see approach as to deciding which musicians he wants to tour and record with. "I'm at a point in my life now where I don't have to have a permanent band," says Ozzy. "The beauty of being Ozzy is that it doesn't matter who I get up there with us, as long as I get up there." It's been 30 years since Ozzy first picked up a mic with Black Sabbath, a dizzying career in which he has frequently scaled the heights of heavy metal stardom and hit rock bottom just as often. "I haven't sat on my ass all these years, picking up royalty checks off of a conveyor belt," says Ozzy. "I've worked damn hard to get where I am." Today he has a few battles left to fight. Drug-free since 1991, Ozzy continues to lead a healthy lifestyle that includes intense daily workout regimen. Recently, he even triumphed over one of his last remaining vices, tobacco. "I've done all kinds of drugs, but cigarettes are one of the most addictive things I've ever put into my body." His annual Ozzfest tour, now in its second year, continues to be one of the highest grossing summer packages. Ozzy is currently putting the finishing touches on a new project with a reunited Black Sabbath, a live recording of two shows the band played last December in its hometown of Birmingham, England. The album, set for release this fall, will also feature two new studio tracks, a possible sign that a full Black Sabbath reunion album is on its way. "It's so nice," says Ozzy, "especially after all the hostility, the anger, and the bad things we said about each other over the years, to come full circle and be friends again." Today he is on top of the world, an obvious sign that the madman side of Ozzy Osbourne has been long laid to rest, along with a few headless winged creatures in a house full of shotgun cats. He survived all his battles and emerged victorious at ease with the many misfortunes it's been his misfortune to endure. "Well, almost. I have no real regrets," says Ozzy, "except that I wasn't up to keeping Randy Rhoads from getting on that plane. I'm no Superman, no person from another planet, I'm just a lucky guy. Rest in peace, Ozzy Osbourne.